What if I told you that the $20 bill in your pocket isn't backed by gold, and it isn't backed by the American economy either? It's backed by an aircraft carrier. Since 1974, a secret military arrangement has been the hidden engine of the entire global financial system. And right now, in 2026, as the United States wages war in the Middle East, that arrangement is being tested for the very first time in its existence. The outcome will affect the price of everything you buy, the interest rate on your mortgage, and the future of the most powerful empire in human history. This is the story nobody teaches you in economics class.
To understand how we got here, you need to go back to July 1944. World War II is still raging. Nazi Germany is retreating, but Allied leaders are already planning for what comes after. Representatives from 44 nations gathered in a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and here they made a decision that would shape the next century of human history. Every major currency would be pegged to the US dollar. The dollar itself would be backed by gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. The United States had emerged from the war with the world's largest gold reserves, so if you held dollars, you were holding gold, effectively. For 25 years, this system worked beautifully. It anchored global trade, kept inflation low, and made the U.S. the undisputed financial capital of the world. By the late 1960s, the dollar was used in roughly 80% of all international transactions. American banks financed the reconstruction of Europe. The dollar was as good as gold, literally. But then something started to crack. The crack came from Vietnam. The United States was spending billions fighting a war in Southeast Asia and printing dollars to pay for it. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, started getting nervous. They did the math. The US didn't have enough gold to cover all the dollars floating around the world, so they started cashing in. By August 1971, the US gold reserve had fallen to just 10,000 metric tons, less than half its peak. The system was on the verge of collapse. And then, on a Sunday evening in August 1971, President Nixon went on national television and made an announcement that shocked the world. He was ending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Just like that, in 15 minutes of broadcast time, a 25-year global financial architecture was dismantled. The dollar was now backed by nothing. Markets panicked, inflation spiked, and then, in 1973, the Arab oil embargo hit. OPEC nations cut off exports to countries that had distorted Israel, sending oil prices through the roof. The U.S. economy was in free fall. Into this chaos stepped one man with a plan. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, flew to Saudi Arabia, and in a series of meetings in 1974, he negotiated a deal that would become the hidden architecture of the modern world. The agreement was kept classified by the U.S. government for over 4 decades. It only became public in 2016 when Bloomberg News forced its release through a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Archives. And when you read it, you understand everything. The United States would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia's oil fields and its royal family. In return, Saudi Arabia would do 2 things: price all of its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and invest its surplus oil revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively lending the profits back to Washington. 3 months after the oil embargo lifted in March 1974, Washington and Riyadh publicly signed a broad cooperation agreement. In fiscal year 1975, the 2 countries finalized $2 billion in military contracts, including 60 fighter jets delivered to the kingdom. The dollar now had a new backing, not gold, oil, and not just oil, the American military guarantee that kept the oil flowing. This arrangement created a self-reinforcing loop of almost magical efficiency. Here is how it works. Every country in the world needs oil. Oil is priced in dollars, so every country needs dollars. To get dollars, they trade goods and services with America, or they buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Those Treasury purchases effectively finance the U.S. government spending. The U.S. uses some of that spending on its military, and that military protects the oil fields and shipping lanes that keep the whole system running. It is a perpetual motion machine, and it explains something that has baffled economists for decades. How can the United States run enormous budget deficits, print trillions of dollars, and somehow not collapse? Because the rest of the world needs those dollars. They have no choice but to absorb them. Think of it like a protection racket.
except global and technically voluntary. To enforce the arrangement, the U.S. maintains Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, its largest airbase in the entire Middle East, capable of supporting nearly 100 aircraft. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, operating out of Naval Support Activity Bahrain, with approximately 9,000 military personnel, provides security across the Persian Gulf, the body of water through which 20% of all the world's oil flows. Without the military, there is no security guarantee. Without the security guarantee, there is no dollar oil pact. Without the dollar oil pact, there is no global reserve currency. The gun and the greenback are one and the same thing. For decades, this system seemed unshakable, but in the last few years, cracks have appeared, and they are getting harder to ignore. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 72% in 2001 to just 56.77% in 2025, the lowest level since the International Monetary Fund began tracking the data in 1995. That is a massive structural shift playing out in slow motion. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and newer members including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Indonesia, now represents roughly 45% of the world's population and more than 35% of global GDP by purchasing power parity. These nations have been deliberately reducing their dollar exposure. China and Russia now conduct most of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. India has bought Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China signed a yuan-real trade settlement agreement, and China has built a rival to SWIFT, the messaging network behind most international dollar transactions. In March 2026, China's payment network CIPS processed a record 1.22 trillion yuan, roughly $178.5 billion, across nearly 42,000 transactions in a single month, with average daily transaction values rising nearly 50% compared to February. Meanwhile, central banks around the world have been buying gold at a rate exceeding 1,000 metric tons per year for 3 consecutive years. That is a quiet but unmistakable message. The world is building reserves that do not depend on Washington. The exit is slow, but it is underway.
And then came 2026, and the biggest stress test the petrodollar has ever faced. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint military strikes against Iran, triggering the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The world watched as Iran, which sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which 20% of the world's oil and natural gas flows, asserted control over the strait. And here is the detail that should keep every economist awake at night. According to Lloyd's List, the maritime intelligence service that has tracked global shipping for nearly 300 years, at least 2 vessels have already paid transit fees through the strait, not in dollars, but in yuan. Iran was selling approximately 1.22 million barrels of oil per day to China during the conflict, transacted outside the dollar system. A Deutsche Bank strategist warned the war might trigger the decline of petrodollar supremacy while starting the petro-yuan system. The dollar's share of global reserves hit 56.77%, its lowest in 30 years. Now, to be precise, the dollar still shows remarkable structural resilience. The Bank for International Settlements 2025 survey found the dollar on one side of 89.2% of all foreign exchange transactions, actually up from 88.4% in 2022. Yuan accounts for less than 2% of global reserves. Paul Bluestein at CSIS argues that deep, liquid U.S. financial markets and sheer network effects sustain dollar dominance. Everybody uses the dollar because everybody else uses the dollar. And Alpine macro strategist Dan Alamariu dismisses the petro-yuan as far-fetched, noting Gulf nations have strong incentives to stay aligned with Washington given China's alignment with Iran. But the Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is the physical embodiment of the link between American military power and American financial power. And for the first time in 50 years, that link is being openly challenged, in real time, on the nightly news.
So why does any of this matter to you personally? You are not a central banker. You do not trade oil futures. Here is why. The petrodollar system is the reason Americans can afford to live the way they do. When the rest of the world is forced to hold dollars and buy U.S. Treasury bonds, it keeps American interest rates artificially low. That means cheaper mortgages, cheaper car loans, cheaper credit card debt. It means the US government can run deficits that would bankrupt any other nation without triggering runaway inflation. Every time you swipe a credit card, take out a home loan, or buy a car, you are quietly benefiting from a military-backed oil deal that most Americans have never heard of, struck in secret in 1974, revealed only in 2016. If that system unravels, even partially, the cost of everything in your life goes up. Interest rates rise. The government can no longer borrow as cheaply, which means either higher taxes or deeper cuts. The comfortable cushion that the petrodollar has provided to American living standards for 50 years begins to compress. You are not insulated from this. You are living inside it.
The petrodollar system was built for a world where the U.S. was the unchallenged military and economic superpower, a world where oil was the only energy that mattered, and the dollar was the only currency that was trusted. That world is shifting. Renewable energy is gradually reducing oil's central role. China has built parallel financial infrastructure, and the 2026 Iran war has placed the Strait of Hormuz, the physical choke point of the entire petrodollar machine, directly at the center of a live military conflict. The dollar is not going to collapse tomorrow. The network effects are too powerful, the alternatives too immature. But for the first time in 50 years, the question is no longer whether the system will change, it is how fast. And here is the thought I want to leave you with. Every great reserve currency in history, the pound sterling, the Dutch guilder, the Spanish real, eventually gave way to something else, not in a dramatic single moment, but in a slow erosion that most people did not notice until it was already over. Are we watching that erosion happen right now, in real time? And if we are, what does the world look like on the other side? That is the question nobody in Washington wants to answer, but history suggests someone will have to.